We are delighted to have, this is a really, really busy time for Peter Iwanowicz, who's here with us today. And so we're grateful that he's taking the time to share some really important information with us. Peter has more than 25 years of environmental and public health advocacy experience working both outside of government and within. And he's currently the executive director of the Environmental Advocates New York, a position he's held since 2013. 2018 or 2013? 2013. Okay. No, I just don't have my glasses on. So before he took the helm at Environmental Advocates, he was an assistant vice president with the American Lung Association in Washington, D.C., where he directed the association's Healthy Air Campaign, a national effort to defend the Clean Air Act. Peter was an appointee in the Spitzer and Patterson administrations, serving in several positions, including acting commissioner of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, deputy secretary for environment in the governor's office, and the very first director of the New York State Office of Climate Change. Thank you so much for being with us, Peter.
Okay. I've got this here, and I'll keep the mic up as close as I can. So, thank you, Sue Shell, for inviting me to speak here today. Pastor Heather, for opening up the church to be able to talk this morning. I'm going to keep the presentation light and very focused, and happy to entertain questions along the way if you have them. And if you say the questions, I'll repeat them so the folks on Zoom can hear them well. And just a quick hand in the back, the gentleman in the black mask. Am I coming through okay? You can hear me okay? Super, wonderful, thank you. I'm here to talk about a proposal that's on the New York State ballot. Some of you may have already voted by mail. Some of you may have already voted early. I hope you have seen this proposal if that's the case. If you haven't voted, you have a little bit more time today to vote early. And on Tuesday is your last opportunity to vote in person. This is Proposal 2. I know a lot of people call them propositions, but in New York, we always do things differently. In New York, they're called proposals. But the basic campaign is to urge people to vote yes for Prop number 2, and I will walk through a little bit of why I would encourage you to vote yes on this. First, a little bit of history of Environmental Advocates NY. We are an organization that has been in Albany and has called the city of Albany our home for more than 50 years. We're actually just down the block at the corner of Hamilton and Dove. We typically work on statewide policy issues, shaping things down at the state capitol, trying to push the administration of New York towards greater policies that will protect New York's environment, people, and conserve natural resources in the environment. When I took over the helm at Environmental Advocates, I had the experience of spending a lot of time inside of government. I worked a lot in the environmental space for the national organization, the American Lung Association, as Sue said, just before I came back to lead Environmental Advocates in 2013. I ran a campaign for them based in Washington, D.C., but truth be told, I burned a lot of carbon pollution flying back and forth every week. Tried to offset as best as I could with tree planting activities. But I called Albany my home since I walked out of undergraduate program at Siena College in 1989, and really happy to be here. Personal background, I grew up outside of Boston, moved here to go to college and stayed. Love the area. And my wife and I have 2 kids. One's still an undergraduate, one is now a graduate. So we've made this area our home. We love it. Environmental Advocates has made the city of Albany its home, and we love being here as part of the city. As I said, we focus on statewide policy issues, but when I came back to Environmental Advocates, when I say back, I was a program associate in the early 1990s at Environmental Advocates working on policy back in those days. So this was a return back to the organization where I really cut my policy teeth as a young advocate in the 90s. And returning home, I felt there was a higher role for environmental advocates to play. not to reinvent ourselves as a grassroots group, because there are wonderful grassroots organizations around there, but environmental advocates had to be better in tuned in working with organizations and people across New York State and community, listening to their issues, getting more intently focused on helping out on those issues, and trying to address the crises that were in so many different communities from our perch in the state capitol and elsewhere. And two crises that really formed the basis and the foundation for why we are at this point in time with this environmental rights ballot initiative. Two of them really stand out for me. First is the drinking water quality crisis in Hoosick Falls. Our organizations and others went to Hoosick Falls, traveled there, met with the residents who were drinking contaminated water and looking for relief, and helped them work their way through the state capitol to get meaningful laws changed in terms of statute of limitations on claims for pollution-related illnesses, regulations, and a sweeping new take on how New York State will regulate the chemicals that have poisoned the water in Hoosick Falls. We were essentially their lobbyists, their public relations firm, and a group of advocates that knows how to get voices heard. And it was an honor to work with the parents and the families in Hoosick Falls to elevate those issues. But they would always ask us in the meetings with them, don't we have a right to drink clean water? Don't our kids have this right to drink water that's not going to make them sick or worse? And the answer, obviously, as humans and morally, is yes. But in the eyes of the law in New York State, there wasn't such a right. There's a lot of things in our Bill of Rights, if you look at it. There's 18 different subsections in our Bill of Rights. Nowhere in our Bill of Rights is anything about the right to drink water that won't make you sick. We also got intently focused in the south end of Albany, working with the residents of Ezra Prentice Homes, the public housing facility there, working with members of a village, a strong community-based organization, to try to push back against, at that point in time, the desires of a big national, international oil company. And I don't know if you knew this, but that they had desires to create the third largest crude oil transfer hub in the United States here in Albany. You know, our communications folks dubbed it, I guess they think of us as oil being, not Albany. Thank you. It worked. But again, this is a community. It's an environmental justice community. It is populated by black and brown people. It is traditionally one of those areas where it becomes a dumping ground for air pollution issues, for literally trash and garbage. They were living a chain-link fence away from very dangerous crude oil trains, dubbed bomb trains. And on top of that, there was this big desire by this company to expand operations there and pollution with it. And we got intensely involved with a number of other organizations here and succeeded on thwarting that company's desires. There's still a lot of work to do there because of the diesel truck traffic and other issues going on. But again, you know, Willie White, who led the organization at the time, a village, asked me personally the same question we heard in Hoosick Falls. Don't we have a right to breathe air that's not going to make us sick? And I gave him the same answer. Of course you do, Willie. But in the eyes of New York State, we don't. So the residents of Hoosick Falls, the residents of South Albany, actually is where I think this whole idea of shooting for, finally, adding environmental rights to our state's constitution really was fomented. It matches up, you know, rather poignantly with a couple of other people in my life, because this policy actually was introduced in the state legislature. I think it was 1997 by then Assemblyman Richard Brodsky, who passed away right as the COVID crisis was unfolding for all of us in April of 2020. He was the chair of the Assembly Environmental Conservation Committee, certainly a visionary, a person who was ahead of his time. And Richard introduced a very simple one-word bill. And I remember looking at it when I was that kid advocate at Environmental Advocates and thinking to myself, I get the concept, but I don't have time for this. You know, we're fighting to try to get a lot of different things done at this moment in time. This really just, you know, it didn't waft over me at the time how important and transformational a change in the state constitution could be. Our politics were a little bit different in Albany at the time as well. But it's always stuck in the back of my head that we didn't have that constitutional right. So you match that up with something rattling around in the young advocate's head for a number of years, with this plight of these communities and this desire to add constitutional rights to clean air and clean water, bring in a very hostile administration in Washington, D.C. that was anti-environmental, and the moment really started to seem right that this was the time to bring back that language, to begin to push in Albany for a change in our Constitution. And here is what the language says. If you haven't voted yet, you haven't flipped over the ballot to take a look at it, proposal number 2. This is the language. It says, each person, dwell on that for a minute, each person, so no matter where you live, your race, your color, your ethnicity, your income level, each person shall have a right to clean air and water in a healthful environment. That's it. 15 very simple, yet poignant, very elegant, targeted words. I know we'll probably have a discussion about, well, shouldn't we have added some more clarity around it? I've been handling those questions for months now. But it's really important to start off with that understanding that each person shall have these rights. The other person who sort of moves this to the fore with Richard Brodsky was a guy named Leon Billings. I'll just take a quick, anybody ever heard of Leon Billings? Well, if you took my policy class at SUNY Albany, you would have heard of Leon Billings, because I wax philosophically of all these leaders that have built such strong beg-lock laws. Leon Billings was a staffer for Ed Muskie in the Senate in the early 70s. And Ed Muskie was known as leading the Environment Public Works Committee and shaping our bedrock environmental laws, clean air, clean water. And Leon in the 1990s was then a member of the Maryland legislature, and he ran something called the National Conference of Environmental Legislators. And Leon had this idea of we should add environmental rights to the U.S. Constitution. But in order to get there, let's go state by state. The state representative to the National Conference of Environmental Legislators was Richard Brodsky. Leon passed, very unfortunately, about a week after the election in 2016 of a stroke. He was a dear guy. I had the pleasure of working with him and very closely with his son, who's a vice president at the American Lung Association. The reason why I want to dwell on these people is really because this is the foundation for how we build these things, and this is the vision. And Leon knows the Clean Air Act better than anybody. And he understood its limitations, but he also understood the power of constitutional change in adopting an environmental right and how that would work in harmony with the federal Clean Air Act. And I think this environmental right added to New York's Constitution is going to do the same thing. It will add extra weight to those community members who were striving to get government to act quicker to clean up pollution. It will add extra weight to the arguments that we bring to local government officials to be better on local zoning, to stop, the proposals and projects that are going to, set us back in our fight against climate change and clean water and clean air. It will give citizens the ability to push government to be a lot better than it is now. And it will give government the tools to screen their decisions against this right. This eloquent right that each person shall have this right to clean air and clean water in a healthful environment. So I'm just going to wrap up real quickly and entertain questions. So here we are now. This idea, this concept, passion and desires of people working in communities, wondering why they don't have this right, matched up with an organization that understands how to move things in the state capitol and shape public policy and get legislators to do their job. Here we are, where we have millions of New Yorkers looking at that ballot this month, looking at that ballot on Tuesday, looking at that question, having no idea how this thing all came about. You guys are now ahead of the game. What a beautiful concept of moving this idea, the passion, the desires, the needs of New York citizenry, moving an idea into the legislative space. It was introduced in 2017. The State Assembly passed this legislation in 2017 and 2018. It wasn't until 2019, when the Senate turned to a different leadership, that bill came up for even a vote in the Senate. And we had argued all along in 2017 and 2018 that If you bring this bill up in the Senate, it will pass. It will have bipartisan support. But the leadership understood the value of this proposal and what it might mean to shaping our environment, and were reluctant to sort of cross their allies in big business. New legislature in 2019 was brought up on their first Earth Day agenda, and guess what? It passed handily with bipartisan support, just as we predicted it would. The Constitution then says that you need to bring this up a second time before the legislature after an ensuing election. The first time we could do that after 2019 was 2021. It was the second day of the Senate session this year. They brought this bill up. It passed. Again, bigger margins, bipartisan. Assembly got around to doing it in early February. Same story there. It passed. Bigger margins than in 2019, bipartisan support. A lot of people speaking out forcefully about this need for right to protect our environment and move it forward. And then present this opportunity, as the Constitution asks us to do. Present the opportunity to the voters and ask the question, shall we add this language to our Constitution? That's what the ballot question asks. Again, the language. Each person shall have a right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment. So here's the other thing you need to know. If a majority of voters on this question alone say yes to it, it gets added to the Constitution. There's no other act of government that's needed. The legislature doesn't have to approve it. The governor doesn't have any say. That's over. It's now up to us to decide whether we, as people, want to add this right to our state's Constitution. And how beautiful is that? I mean, often we go to the polls with the hope that the politicians who have promised something will live up to their promises when they're in office. But we get to go in, check off the box, and enough of our family and friends say yes, we get it. Such an empowering sort of moment. So, anyways, I'll wrap up and entertain questions that you might have about the amendment, the process, how we got here. But I wanted to share with you a little bit of the story, the genesis of this amazing question that's presented to millions of New Yorkers today, because it's here in the capital region. But those Hoosick Falls moms, the families that live there, the residents of the south end of Albany, they understood too that this was also about pollution prevention in communities that weren't struggling with the crisis there. And that's just an amazing, powerful testament to the strength and resolve, but just the beauty of them as humans wanting to fight for something better for other communities before they ran into that problem. So it's really, when I say it's an honor and privilege to be working with these folks and fighting with them for these things, that's what it's all about for me, is that they understand out of their crisis, they want action better for other people so that those families don't have to go through it as well. So thank you again, Sue, Pastor Heather. It's really been a pleasure to be here. I'll happy to entertain questions you have about the amendment. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. So the question is, for those who are on their online participation here, the question is, what is my response to those who are making the argument that this is going to hand over control of pollution to the courts and not in the legislature? When we looked at other amendments, like a sound basic education that is built in the law, the courts upheld that principle and then mandated the legislature to figure out how to fund it. So the courts will have certainly a role if government doesn't act to uphold this right, and interpreting the right and providing greater clarity to local governments, to state governments, and others. But I don't foresee the court determining how much pollution is deemed healthful or not. The courts will interpret things and look at science and tell government, your decision was lacking for these reasons, go back and be better. And they do that now under existing environmental statutes, and they tell the legislature what's required of them, under court rulings in terms of funding a sound basic education. But the courts stop short of sort of mandating what standard, if you will, how many parts per million of pollution of air is healthful or not. How much money needs to go in these programs? The courts have never, waded into that space because they respect the right of legislatures and governors to dictate budget things. I hope I answered your question. Let's go. A couple in the back. We'll go with.
What are the
Right. So if for some reason, the voters decide not to add this to the Constitution, all of us will have to take a hard look at and understanding why voters decided they didn't want to add this to the Constitution. Was it something about its brevity? Was it just a lack of desire to open up more sort of, interpretation of our environmental standards? The reasons why. And we go back at it. We will refine a piece of legislation and go to the legislature in 2022 and try to move an alternative, some other language through that process and try to get this back before voters. The soonest we could do it, if it fails on Tuesday, would be to move it through the legislative process and have it on the ballot in 2023. So it'll take some time, but that's the process. I'm going to just go in the back, Dan, to the gentleman in the maroon, and up here. Yep. Oh, hi, Tom. Didn't recognize you behind the mask. Tom, wait. Because I didn't have my glasses on either, because they fog up with my mask. I hope you know Tom's instrumental work, leadership. I don't know. It's just it's great to be with you, Tom. Your work down in the South Emmental Village is really tremendous. And it's well the bomb train story and everything else that we've worked on together there.
I don't really have a question, but I do want to thank you as being one of the major driving organizations who stepped in and stopped the oil trade, and which, by the way, will never be over until we actually make that transition to clean energy, until there's no longer any need. One of the reasons it's not happening now is that they're still looking around. Global is still trying to make friends in the South End, and you will lay in it. So I really want to thank you. The other major issue that is not solvable right now is the urban issue in South End. I think that the people that I talk to and work with at Ezra Planet are discouraged because they see lots of action and they don't see anything coming down. And this will be some hope, but we have to find a way to actually make something happen. So, thank you for being here. This is a step. Oh, and I also want to say that the major reason this proposal may not pass is because it's very misuse of legal language. And one thing saying is that the house is the smallest one there. It's right in the middle. And so you have to go for it. So, that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, it is question number 2. It is the smallest. There's a lot of proposals out there and a lot of background reading. We tried to keep it simple for folks, but Tom's right. Make sure you flip that ballot over, look for proposal 2, and vote yes on it. It's really important. And thanks again, Tom, for your kind words, but really your leadership and your vision, and also your steadfast advocacy in making sure that we are continually educated as to what's going on in the South End is critically important. So, Dan, and we'll go over that.
Thanks so much. I just want to make a little advertisement for our rabbit hole at the Marcelo Center. There was some very extensive and lots of people that were looking at this, like more detail. It's really something that's not just coming out to the icon that they're very easy to wait on the similar investments with Point Housing in Pennsylvania and Montana.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Dan, if it's okay, I'm just going to inform the folks that it may be online of that. So there's a great paper at the Rockefeller Institute published by Dr. Laura Rabinow and some of her students there that really goes through the finer points of environmental rights, not only what it would mean here in New York, but also looking at environmental rights as they exist similarly in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the state of Montana. So thanks for elevating that. It's a great paper.
So my question is, with the bond trade, New York is really doing it quite well. It's all kinds of places you're, like people are like become effective. And so it's fair for us to say, not only do we think that people in New York should be exposed like this, we don't think people anywhere should be exposed like this, and we are reducing our oil consumption in an appropriate way so that no one else has to do I mean, just from my understanding of the point of the amendment is to grant standing. It's easy for individuals to have a right. And so the court and say, my rights are being given so high for the right to be here in court.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's ways that New York can grant standing to other people who are damaged by decisions that New Yorkers make about their, about their their lives. We require stuff from other places in the world where it's not made.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. First, let me just say, yes, you're absolutely right that this amendment will empower citizens to perhaps seek relief through the courts. But before we get to that point, this is going to be a really powerful tool for organizations and citizens across New York State to go to the local town planning board, the city council, and say, you can't do this. Like in the town of Bethlehem, they're trying to add more gasoline retail stations. And it just seems completely inconsistent with our climate goals, with our air quality goals, et cetera. But one company has decided, trying time after time to figure out how to add more gas stations at a time when New York State is already by law going to be, expiring internal combustion engines across the spectrum. So we'll be able to go to our town planning board and our zoning board and say, you can't approve this now because we have this right. If they don't do the right thing, then perhaps we have greater standing to use this to go into courts. It's an interesting concept about trying to extend this right or provide a cause of action from somebody in another state because of policies that New York is doing that might harm them, whether it be mining, extraction of oil, transport of different things into this area. I don't know. I'll have to wrestle with that one and think that one through. What I'm hopeful is that Tuesday we get a powerful vote and this does get added to our Constitution, notwithstanding the cautions about where we have to go next. And that we can then build this environmental rights into other state constitutions and indeed the U.S. Constitution. And that might be one way to start, helping people address this on a multiple level. But we should start to think about the way the European Union thinks about it is, the broader footprint of our decision making. I think it's a really great concept. I'd love to sit down with some legal scholars after we get through Tuesday to figure out where we go next with this type of work. And also we should ensure that New York State adopts the right policies for the take back of things like solar panels after the useful life, so that we're ensuring that the producers of these technologies, as wonderful as they are, they do have, as Dan pointed out, some toxic chemicals in them and some issues related to them that we want to ensure that they're recycled, reused, repurposed rather than wantonly disposed. And right now we don't have those types of standards on things like photovoltaics or other solar panels or other technologies. So we can be better in that regard too and try to be a nation leader again. So hope I've addressed your question, even though I don't have a good one for the how do we enable people, empower people to be pushing New York, people outside of the state to push New York to be better. But it's a good concept. Okay. I know Sue had a question. Anybody? We'll explore over here. I've been focusing. Any questions on this side? Maybe the first one from over here. Sue? Or? There are two states in the country that have something similar to what we're trying to do in New York, where it's embedded in their Bill of Rights. Other states have environmental rights sort of sprinkled throughout in different sections, but they're not self-executing, meaning they apply to all of our state decisions. New York has a little bit of this right embedded in Article 14, which is the forever wild clause of our Constitution, but courts have not applied that broadly. So our Adirondack organizations we're working with say, let's get this because this would apply this type of concept, across New York State, including the Adirondacks. Did you have a question or were you just pointing out?
I was wondering, he's telling me that he involves the cleanest water in the world is that she refuses to drink water out of that tap.
Yeah. I mean, that's the problem here. And the question was, what's the state of the water purity in Hoosick Falls, and is it safe enough to drink or not? I think the issue here for many in Hoosick Falls is it took citizens rising up to push their town, and indeed the state, and really push the state to get involved and understand this impact dramatically. So I can understand and fully appreciate the distrust level. If you measure the water out of the tap when the filtration systems are on and operating, those filters do capture this pollutant and capture it well. But people need to sort of understand, again, this is government telling them that stuff, and with government sampling, and there's a lot of distrust based on how they were treated initially from government there. Well, I mean, I think really, if she wanted to be comfortable about it, she could have her, and it's expensive, and government's not funding this, independently tested, not only for that, but you want to look for other chemicals like lead and other what we call emerging contaminants that are out there. It may be reduced, or they're finding what they say, the government tells us, is non-detect levels of that chemical in the drinking water. But again, filters need to be changed, so it could be fine one day, but maybe not, several weeks later as the filter's not changed. Depends also if they're on sort of the municipal water or the well water too. I know of them, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of folks that are sick, some who have passed away, dying. Michael Hickey was the one that pushed government to be better. But we often think about, what if we had this constitutional right in the books? Would that government response have been faster? I would say yes, because the threat of violating a civil right of clean water in that instance would have pushed government to be better. It would have given legal weight right out of the gate. But that's kind of what's going on there. The one thing to think about too with the water quality crisis there, and you can filter this stuff out there, but we don't treat this chemical as hazardous waste, and those filters are not being disposed of in hazardous waste environments. So they can be very small ones or very big ones, but they're just sort of thrown with regular municipal waste. Or worse, they've been sent over to the incinerator in Cohoes, burned there without adequate controls, and then released back into the environment through air emissions. So we have to really think holistically about these problems, which is why we want to get rights like these baked into our Constitution. So I know I'm probably coming up and butting up or over time, but the question and answer has been very good. Do we have time for one more, Sue? Anybody? Okay, in the back, yeah.
Do you know, looking into that, how it is other countries,
So, yes, I don't have the exact number of other countries that have it. The UN Human Rights Commission just voted beginning of this month to adopt this as a sort of an international right through that process. There were many media stories shockingly suggesting that the U.S. was not supportive of that, though they don't have a seat on the Human Rights Commission. The Biden administration was not being as supportive of adding that right. But the UN Human Rights Commission did adopt this as something that should be and recognized as a right of all people. That was earlier this month. So process is moving forward. There are other efforts underway to give natural systems like rivers, parcels of land, individual rights too, and that's a whole sort of other aspect of this work that's going on both here in the U.S. and elsewhere. So I apologize, I don't have figures off the top of my head of how many countries, but you won't be surprised that more enlightened advocates and more enlightened advocacy has driven nations to adopt this sooner than the U.S. Great. Well, again, Sue, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Pastor Heather, thank you as well. I really appreciate the conversation. Tom, it's good to see you. It's good to be with you all. Thank you very much.
Just want to express our really sincere thanks, Peter. And again, in the midst of a really, really busy time for you, I'm sure you're always busy, but thank you very much for being here with us. And thanks everybody for caring enough to stay after and hear about this. And our congregation's going to continue to work hard. We have an Earth Care resolution and an Earth Care team and a lot of good people who are trying to work on issues too for the climate and the earth. So thank you so much for being with us. Yes, we will. We'll share that with you. Thanks, everybody.